Hello and welcome to the Masonic Authors Guild International. This is Robert L.D. Cooper with Mark A. Tabbert. We are Magi. Our mission is to promote the highest standards in education, research and publications relating to the global phenomenon of Freemasonry.
Cherno M. Cisse, Jr., The Dialectic of Representation, Black Freemasonry, the Black Public, and Black Historiography. Journal of African American Studies, September 2013, Volume 17, Number 3. In 1787, African Lodge Number 459, having been organized in Boston in 1775, received a charter from the English Grand Lodge in London. A prior provisional warrant gained from an American lodge legitimized the group of color. However, it did not grant them the authority to raise new members. The Charter of 1787 confirmed that the English Grand Lodge had entered the Black Bostonians on their list of all official lodges. As part of maintaining the legitimacy of the Black Lodge, its organizer, Prince Hall, maintained a regular correspondence with the English authorities. In addition to sending the, quote, general regulations of the African Lodge, end quote, to Great Britain, Hall also sent drafts of public addresses meant to illustrate the history of Freemasonry as a sacred unfolding and to reveal and explain the role of Africans and their descendants in this tradition. Hall published 3 public speeches in 1789, 1792, and 1797 that comprise the extant record of early Black Masonic thought and reflection. The first charge was crafted and preached by the Black Atlantic itinerant Methodist preacher and Freemason John Morant, and the second 2 were written by Hall. Wanting critique for his explication of Masonic history, Hall provided drafts to both the Grand Lodge and to the Reverend William Bentley from Salem, Massachusetts, a white Freemason esteemed for his worldliness, his intellect, and his knowledge of Masonic ritual. Appraising the work of Hall, Bentley commented that his, quote, charge, though not correct, was useful, end quote. Hall's response has not survived. However, Bentley's appraisal raises revealing questions. If Hall's charge was in fact, quote, not correct, end quote, how did it err and what did it mistake? And if this piece was still, quote, useful, end quote, from where and for whom did it derive meaning? Although these questions do not have direct answers, these issues reflect the dialectical tensions of early Black Freemasonry and its thought. Although the African Lodge represented a small and self-selected group, Black Masonic thought described Black identity in the broadest descriptive and discursive terms. African American Freemasons led the earliest written abolitionist campaign in New England, and in doing so, they necessarily defined all Black people as sharing an identity arising from a common experience of bondage. In addition, they challenged Masonic histories that obscured the role of Africans in Masonic traditions of building that arose from biblical chronology and from the belief that societies evolved in a constantly progressive manner. Black Freemasonry revised Masonic history as it also challenged the pejorative understandings of Africa and its diaspora that prevailed in emerging ideas about freedom, citizenship, and race. While there's an extensive literature on the formation of Northern African American identity, from the Revolutionary War to the beginning of the 19th century, scholars have only begun to investigate the importance of Black Freemasonry during this period and to examine it as a product and source of dialectical tensions in the formation of Black identity, abolition, and historiography. The actions and thought of the earliest African American Masons challenged the fundamental discursive premises of a social and political order while also adopting basic tenets of that ideological system. However, scholars have understood this response in terms of either accommodation or critique. The first interpretation presents Black Freemasons as advocating elitism and social uplift at the expense of questioning American nationalism and nascent economic disparities. The contrasting view describes the First Lodge of African Americans as a covert and private realm where a select group successfully represented a larger Black community by taking an oppositional stance to hegemonic discourses that authorized slavery and racial hierarchy. Within Black Masonic thought and action, its critique of the racial prescriptions arising from a nascent American nationalism and its investment in ideas of respectability marked a fraught relationship. The idea of respectability is a weighted term in contemporary scholarship. And moreover, the array of late 18th century understandings of the term, both implicit and explicit, reflected different perspectives of class, culture, gender, and race. However, historian Patrick Rail usefully explained that Black respectability illustrated much more than, quote, a mere luxury that might benefit the living standards of a Black elite, end quote. Instead, Rail argued that the ideological potency of respectability, its descriptive force as a, quote, master value, end quote, derived from its capacity, quote, to implant the imprimatur of consensual value to whatever it modified. That which was respectable could be regarded as universally valued, end quote. As Rail further noted, the quality of respectability conferred worth because it, quote, tended to connote a set of values closely linked with the qualities required for material and moral success in an expanding market, end quote, economy where freedom and free labor increasingly, but certainly not fully, informed categories of citizenship and political agency. By using this broad but historical definition of respectability, the manuscript reveals the tensions between related but also conflicting dimensions of respectability. Respectability represented those self-affirming practices and patterns that African Americans performed against the prescriptive and denigrating effects of racial prejudice in the absence of Black actors in Masonic histories. Moreover, Freemasons of color critiqued racist whites as being crude, unrefined, and lacking respectability. However, respectability also required that Blacks prove themselves as being worthy of equal citizenship, political power, and Masonic legitimization. So this essay traces these dialectical processes to reveal the contradictions within the African American Masonic espousal of those ideas and behaviors that a broader public deemed respectable. The investment of Black Masons in abolition, respectability, and literacy reflected an anxious intersection between dissent and incorporation. Black Masonic respectability represented an identity that sat in defiant counterpoise to the eviscerating social and political effects of bondage and racial prejudice. In addition, African American Masonic thought articulated an abiding commitment to Enlightenment and Protestant ideas about universal equality. However, Freemasons of color also sought the affirming acknowledgement of those individuals and institutions that held complex and ambivalent views about Black character. Emerging definitions of freedom and equality in the late 18th century Anglo-Atlantic world were diverse and even contradictory. For example, the kind of Anglo-cosmopolitanism that characterized 18th century Freemasonry, despite its pejorative distinctions between the worldly and parochial, or its contrasting of the refined to the crude, assumed a homogeneity among persons and even cultures that contrasted with pre-Enlightenment social, political, and religious caste systems. This universalism informed the anti-racism of Black Freemasonry and reflected the Black Masonic concern for the African diaspora. In consequence, the desire of Black Masons to be respectable reflected their demand for recognition as a function of abolitionism, historiographical revision. Morant and Hall spoke on behalf of all African descendants in the diaspora, yet their ideas certainly did not reflect the perspectives or experiences of the entire African diaspora. Underlying the complicated issue of representation operated another dialectical mechanism of political activism. Writing on behalf of Black Freemasonry and against racial marginalization, Morant and Hall sought to occupy two opposing positions simultaneously, both a counter-public that espoused egalitarianism and a universal public that sanctioned limited definitions of equality. This essay examines this tension to argue that the same traits that made Black Freemasonry unique and novel, its narrow self-selection, its abolitionist origins, and its arguments in print, also structured its conscious drive to represent African Americans in debates about freedom, racial equality, and Masonic history. Petitioning for freedom and forming the first African Lodge. African Lodge No. 1, the first Black Lodge, formed when 15 African American men were initiated by an Irish soldier stationed in Boston as part of the British occupation in 1775. The retreating British forces left the new Masons without an official lodge charter. Yet, under the guidance of Prince Hall, this group gained full certification from the English Grand Lodge in London in 1784 and received their permit in 1787. Thereafter, African Lodge No. 1 entered the lodge rolls of the Grand Lodge as African Lodge No. 459. The emergence of the African Lodge coincided with the late 18th century expansion of Freemasonry into the ranks of middling men and the rising Anglo-Atlantic abolitionist movement. The historian Stephen Bullock described how the mystical and secretive aura of lodge membership, combined with the publicly understood Masonic symbols of construction and measurement, attracted a younger generation of men who believed that Masonry would educate them in science and construction while also revealing to them timeless wisdom. In addition, this generation viewed Masonic membership as signifying repute and civic virtue. In consequence, American Freemasonry experienced a shift from being represented by a small group of pre-war leading lights like Benjamin Franklin and George Washington to becoming a vehicle for ambitious non-elites to establish themselves as men of significance in the new republic. Reasons of race barred blacks from joining white lodges. White Americans did not easily accept blacks as members or allow the formation of separate black lodges. The esteemed Bostonian, the Reverend John Eliot, writing in the 1790s, found it, quote, remarkable, quote, that, quote, white and black Masons do not sit together in their lodges, quote. Although not a Freemason, Eliot observed that the, quote, truth is whites are ashamed of being on an equality with blacks, end quote. Whites in Philadelphia also moved to prevent the development of black Freemasonry. In 1797, black Masons in Philadelphia wrote to Prince Hall, the leader of the Boston African Lodge, explaining that, quote, the white Masons here say that they are afraid to grant us a warrant for fear the black men living in Virginia would get to be Freemasons too, end quote. While some individual black and white Masons interacted and visited the lodges of the other, race-cleaved American Freemasonry. Eliot also made clear that contests for authenticity and legitimacy unsettled even white Freemasonry. Late 18th century Freemasons in Europe split over disagreements about ritual and historical origins. Irish and Scottish Freemasons called themselves ancients, and in argument with the English Grand Lodge, they asserted that they arose from an older and more legitimate Masonic heritage. This division reached across the Atlantic, with ancients disdainfully labeling English Masons as moderns. And it was also an Irish member of an ancient Irish military lodge who conferred Masonic degrees onto the 15 first members of African Lodge No. 1. Although African Americans added to the broader expansion of Freemasonry, the numbers of black Masons remained small throughout the turn of the 19th century. The lodge never numbered more than 40 members, and patterns of migration made attendance at lodge meetings sporadic and uneven. Before receiving their warrant from the English Grand Lodge, African Lodge No. 1 did not have the authority to initiate new members. Extant records do not indicate the broader interest in black Freemasonry. However, two issues stand out relative to the numbers of black Freemasons. First, their investment in respectability made them selective, and here the admission standards of the lodge contrasted with those of the other significant black institution, African American churches. The exclusive leadership of the African Lodge was certainly known among blacks in urban centers. For example, upon his early 19th century arrival in Boston, the famous David Walker quickly joined African Lodge No. 459. Although few blacks became Freemasons, the earliest ones labored as leaders of abolition and advocates for black education. Though tiny, the African Lodge sought influence as it argued for both integration and transformation. Attracted to the mystery of Masonry and its significance as an institution that conveyed social standing, African Americans understood Masonry to legitimate their actions as public writers and speakers. Yet their desire for respectability and recognition also fostered the selectivity that structured their sense of exclusive masculine leadership. Freemasonry attracted free black men who comprised a cohort of leaders in revolutionary and post-revolutionary Boston. Prince Hall and Peter Bestes, two original members of the African Lodge, helped to author abolitionist petitions written by black Bostonians in the 1770s. Beginning in the 1760s, more and more blacks began to sue for their personal freedom. In 1773, Felix, a black man and probably free, sent the first public black-authored anti-slavery petition to the Massachusetts legislature. Invoking the spiritual equality of all men, Felix asserted that it was God, quote, who loves mankind, end quote, and, quote, who sent his son to die for their salvation, and who is no respecter of persons, end quote. A second Boston petition, also written in 1773, included the signatures of Felix and Peter Bestes. 2 years later, Bestes would become one of the first members of African Lodge No. 1. In an impatient petition published in Boston on January 13, 1777, Hall and 7 other blacks, including Bestes and 2 other members of African Lodge No. 1, wrote to the Massachusetts General Court identifying themselves as, quote, a great number of blacks detained in a state of slavery in the bowels of a free and Christian country, end quote. This was the latest of several petitions that blacks in Massachusetts had written since 1773. Gone from this appeal was the humility and passivity of earlier pleadings. These writers understood that, quote, they have in common with all other men a natural and unalienable right to that freedom which the great parent of the universe hath bestowed equally on all mankind, and which they have never forfeited by any compact or agreement whatever, end quote. Continuing their protest, they wrote, quote, your petitioners have long and patiently waited the event of petition after petition, by them presented to the legislative body of this state, end quote. They further remarked that they could not, quote, but express their astonishment that it have never been considered that every principle from which America has acted in the course of their unhappy difficulties with Great Britain pleads stronger than 1,000 arguments in favors of your petitioners, end quote.
Since Magi launched in February 2024, we have produced more than 275 hours of recorded programs, including historical papers, academic interviews, book reviews, and unabridged audiobooks. Most of these programs are now available through Patreon, Spotify, Apple, and other podcast platforms.